Hello and welcome to Inside IR, the Australian Industrial Relations podcast, the series that arms HR, IR and legal professionals with the latest industrial relations thinking. Today's episode is a little different from our usual format. My conversation with Professor Jennifer Overbeck from the Melbourne Business School on high-stakes enterprise bargaining covered so much ground that we've split it into two parts. In part one, we explore the changing enterprise bargaining landscape, the shifting balance of bargaining power, the role of identity and trust in negotiations, and some practical strategies organisations can use to prepare for bargaining more effectively. Then, in part two, we turn to the challenge of engaging the other side, including influencing unions, challenging long-established negotiating dynamics, navigating arbitration and industrial action, and engaging with your workforce throughout the bargaining process. I hope you enjoyed part one of our discussion with Professor Jennifer Overbeck. Hello and welcome to Inside IR, the Australian Industrial Relations podcast, the series that arms HR, IR and legal professionals with the latest industrial relations thinking. Today on our 33rd episode of Inside IR, we will be covering the very timely topic of high-stakes enterprise bargaining, negotiating skills for a challenging bargaining environment. My name is Rohan Doyle. I'm a partner in the industrial relations practice at Herbert Smith Freehills Kramer. And to help us with this topic today, we have the honour of being joined by a special guest, Professor Jennifer Overbeck from the Melbourne Business School. Welcome, Jen.
Thanks very much, Rohan. I'm delighted to be here.
Professor Overbeck is the Professor of Management at Melbourne Business School and holds a PhD in social psychology from the University of Colorado. Jen has held academic roles in the United States, including at Stanford Graduate School of Business, USC Marshall School of Business, and the University of Utah, before joining Melbourne Business School back in 2014. Jen is an internationally recognised scholar in organisational behaviour and social psychology, and her work is particularly relevant to negotiating tactics and strategy due to its focus on power, status and influence in interpersonal interactions. At Melbourne Business School, Professor Overbeck teaches negotiation and influence across MBA and executive programs, translating her research into practical frameworks for leaders on influence, persuasion and managing complex bargaining situations. Jen, we're very grateful that you accepted our invitation to join us on Inside IR today, because I think employers across Australia could very much use your negotiating expertise right now. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that you've been doing at Melbourne Business School?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Rohan. I teach negotiations, as you mentioned, in our senior executive MBA and our online MBA programs. And I founded and direct our advanced negotiation program, which is an executive program geared toward professionals with a great deal of negotiation training and experience in their background who kind of know the basics and want to move beyond that. And then, of course, as an academic, I also do research. As you mentioned, I focus on power, influence, and negotiations. And I look at how people can do things like more effectively influence others, effectively use their power, what it takes to succeed in influencing. And I've studied how negotiators can improve their outcomes by better mastering the psychology of negotiations. Also, I should mention that lately, and to no small degree thanks to your example, my work has moved more into the IR space, the industrial relations space. And I think it's a really fascinating congruence to think about power and influence in the IR space, especially as traditional power balances shift. And recent regulatory changes bring some important challenges to managing power in that space. So it's an exciting new area that's opened up.
It certainly is, Jen. I'm personally very excited about your shift into the industrial relations space because, as you know, we're at a fairly pivotal moment in industrial relations in Australia. And we're hoping that with your negotiating expertise, you can help us navigate this environment a little bit better. But I'll start with some brief context to perhaps frame the problem for us, and then I might throw to you, Jen, to help us solve it, if that's okay. But it's probably the most challenging bargaining environment that we've seen in industrial relations in some time, from an employer's perspective at least. Why? There's two main reasons. The first is that we really just starting to see the full impact of the industrial relations reforms that kicked off in 2022 and 2023. 3 years or so is just about the right amount of time to start seeing the impacts of those flow through the system. And the impact's been quite significant. So we've had Intractable bargaining laws giving employees and unions for the first time an exit strategy to bargaining if they don't like the deal that's on the table, with a promise that they can't go backwards beyond existing conditions. We have multi-enterprise bargaining laws that now enable unions to force potentially unrelated organisations to bargain together, to rope others into the same deal without their consent, and all under the potential threat of large-scale protected industrial action. It's now also not possible to terminate enterprise agreements as a bargaining tactic. And we also have new powers for unions to force employers to the negotiating table much more easily. Now, these changes are challenging in themselves because they've resulted in employers losing quite a lot of bargaining power. But on top of all of this, the second reason is that we have quite a challenging economic backdrop to all of this. And that's really driving a lot of tension in the system, challenging on both the employer and employee side. On the employee side, workers are understandably pressing for wage increases that either meet inflation or exceed it in order to keep pace and manage the increasingly pressurised situation when it comes to household budgets. Interest rates and fuel costs aren't helping either. But employers, on the other hand, they're under pressure too. We've had many years of escalating costs, not just labour costs, but materials, financing. For many businesses, revenue also hasn't kept up, and we have challenges on that front, not to mention impacts through supply chain disruptions. And all of that's putting real strain on profitability because the wage increases that we're seeing aren't being met with increases in productivity. So what we have, I think, Jen, is both sides of the bargaining table being squeezed by this current situation. How are we seeing that tension play out? Well, there's less flexibility in bargaining the negotiating position on both sides. Employees and unions want more, but employers don't have the capacity to give it. And that's translating into longer bargaining rounds. It's translating into a greater appetite for industrial action. So we're seeing employees and unions realise that in order to get movement, they're increasingly having to resort to industrial action to apply pressure. But also at the same time, we're seeing employers with much more appetite to resist it, given the high stakes involved. And so often we see industrial action impose economic harm on both sides, but without really advancing the negotiation in any material way. So where does all of that take us? More bargaining rounds are going to end up in intractable bargaining arbitration where the parties just simply can't reach agreement themselves. And with both sides more entrenched and less flexible, they also tend to be more focused on protecting their slice of the pie or arguing for a bigger slice rather than those more difficult discussions that are focused on the longer term interests that might result in actually growing the pie. And those discussions would, of course, make for easier negotiations in the future if we're able to have them. Now, back in February, Jen, we heard the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations, the Honourable Amanda Rishworth MP, call for industrial relations participants to move beyond what's been described as the industrial relations pendulum. The view that industrial relations was a zero-sum game and that in order for one side to win, the other side must lose and vice versa. But to do that in the present environment, it does require some difficult discussions at the bargaining table and discussions that many participants probably aren't used to having and certainly aren't having right now. So, Jen, I think that's a fair summary of the problem that employers are currently grappling with in Australian industrial relations. Perhaps we should start with the industrial relations pendulum itself. It has for a long time been stuck in that pendulum metaphor that Minister Rishworth described, a zero-sum game focused on how to slice the pie rather than on how to grow it. How do employers start to change that dynamic?
Way to give me an easy question, Rohan.
Easy one to start with.
Yeah, it's not easy, but there are some things that are worth unpacking here. And, just as a heads up, I think a lot of our conversation is going to end up centering on issues of power and issues of trust. Power that has traditionally been present in IR negotiations, trust that has traditionally not been present. And both of those dynamics need to change for employers to be able to effectively keep up with the changes that are happening in the regulatory environment. So I think we really need a reset, new mindset, new skills, How do we think about power? How do we build trust? And a lot of this really starts with grappling with the difficulty of getting out of intractable positions. When we think about this, financial constraints are obviously part of the picture, but there are also generally deep identity issues and identity conflict that exists between management and labor. And if the parties can't climb out of that identity-based framing, then it becomes almost impossible to move forward to genuine problem solving. So one key element of this, and I think it has to be solved first before progress can really be made, is that employers need to accept that hard truth about the power balance having shifted. That's hard for people to hear. Historically, unions have been a check on employer power. And I know it might not always seem that way, that for employers, the presence of union power has been very salient, but employers could ultimately overcome many of the bargaining tactics that unions used to employ. But now, given that there's no going backward on enterprise agreements, given that there's the inability to terminate the EA in bargaining and unions have that exit strategy, all of that means that unions now have power that they didn't have before. And I've done research with my colleague Peter Kim at the University of Southern California, where we found that powerful negotiators are generally very slow to come to terms with a reversal in their power, that if negotiators no longer have that ability to extract value, when they no longer have the leverage, then they have trouble adapting and taking on different strategies. But in fact, that's exactly what they need to do if they want to be able to move forward. Because once you have less power, it becomes critically important to use influence rather than power. And what I mean is you can't force your way. You have to be able to persuade the other side. And the only way to persuade a negotiating counterpart is to craft an agreement that genuinely satisfies their concerns. Maybe not even all of them, but enough that they feel whole. And that obviously has not always been the history of IR negotiations. Now, the second element, which you mentioned, is the role of identity. People are willing to negotiate all sorts of things, but identity is not one of them. And we're also sort of unaccustomed to thinking about negotiations in this way. But, you can think of public debates right now about things like, what does it mean to be Australian? What's the role of immigration in our country? How should people behave and define themselves? And some people can engage in that debate talking about facts and figures, but for a lot of others, the debate really quickly stops becoming about policy and quickly becomes about who we are in a really deep, fundamental way. And once identity is on the table, we find that facts almost stop mattering. And so, of course, in the IR space, this is amplified enormously. Enterprise bargaining carries a lot of history into the room. The relationship between unions and employers, of course, has been characterized by decades of conflict and mistrust and hard-won battles over pay and conditions. And for union members especially, that history is personal. Being in a union is part of how people understand themselves at a fundamental level, as part of a collective, as people who don't get pushed around. And so when a bargaining round opens, it is rarely just about this year's wage claim. And I find it interesting, employers, I think, often don't think of themselves this way. A lot of employers see themselves as professionals, but don't necessarily recognize that they also have a deeply seated identity that they're bringing to the bargaining table. So if you're in management, you're the person who makes decisions, you're the person who leads, who runs things, who's responsible for the organization. That itself is an identity, and it can feel just as vulnerable in a negotiation where you're being asked to make concessions. So when a union is pushing hard, that's not necessarily just logistical, but it can feel like a challenge to your authority. And that also creates a bit of an intractability. And one of the problems, of course, is then managers don't have a lot of practice naming it that way, especially to themselves. I think if we think about management and unions having different beliefs about how the company's doing or what the negotiation is about, they have different values in terms of management having things around ambition and competitiveness and performance, whereas unions might have solidarity and care for each other. There are rituals such as meetings for management, banter for employees. All of these things come together to create these identities that are really central to what people value and how they see themselves in the world. And then when we come together with somebody who seems very different and very other, it's a whole other element that makes it harder to bridge that gap. Obviously I'm making some generalizations, but there's lots of data about those differences existing. And I think what we can conclude is IR, that space contains all of the elements that lead to intractable identity conflicts. And yet, we're in an era when that's not going to work very well, because what human beings have tended to do is solve those problems through power. They've solved them through things like going to war or imposing sanctions or doing whatever they can to force their way. Obviously, in IR, it's more like imposing contract terms or industrial action. But when you no longer have the power to just win that way, to impose your will, you have to deal with the underlying issues. There's no way through it except to go through it. And so to get to your question, finally, the thing for employers, I think, is that they need to start to accept the change in the power balance and dust off their skills in more collaborative and constructive negotiation approaches. There's been a tendency to think of straight gamesmanship and controlling the board. And I think we're just going to find that that's no longer as effective. One important first step, see the union as not simply representing an adversary, but see them as a collective of people who have their own history, their own vulnerabilities and values, their own identity, and coming into that with respect and care as opposed to just attack, which would immediately put people on the defensive and make them unwilling to work with you creatively.
Thanks, Jen. That's a really important perspective to consider, and so much to unpack there. We'll do our best the time that we've got available on the podcast. But many employers have been stuck in this dynamic for a long time, the same patterns with unions and workforces over decades of enterprise bargaining. Changing that framing is no doubt going to be difficult. Do you have any suggestions for employers on how they might approach this in terms of their pre-bargaining planning, or how they frame the commencement of bargaining with the other bargaining representatives?
Yeah, absolutely. I think employers need to consider two aspects of their pre-negotiation planning. The first thing is what's happening within the company, so within our own side, so to speak. And then there's laying the groundwork with the other side. Within our own side, it's important to align expectations. We should be having really clear conversations as early as possible about what does success look like? What are multiple ways we could get there? And how do we keep ourselves open to recognizing opportunities when we encounter them, whether it's in the bargaining table, at the bargaining table, or elsewhere in the process, without just being fixated on whatever specific cost-cutting approach we might be walking in with. And then a related thing to consider is that often both parties come to the table with a strong mindset that's focused on stemming losses, or what you might call a prevention-framed focus, or prevention-focused frame. It's said both ways, rather than asking how they can avoid losing ground, which can often stop people from thinking creatively. I think there needs to be a very conscious effort to reframe the negotiation around problem solving and develop an intentional negotiation plan. So not just going by the seat of your pants, really going in with a lot of deliberate thought. I use a tool called a negotiation scorecard. We cover this in all of the programs I teach, where we build out a detailed list of the issues. So we think about what exactly are we going to negotiate about it. Could it be wage rates, timing, performance, incentives, all sorts of things. It could include rostering. But we could also get creative and think about, is there something to reward cooperative work patterns, or something around flexibility in job functions, that sort of thing. And we go through and weight those issues. So we think, how important is each one to us? Which ones are more and less important? We put numbers on it, so it's really concrete. And then one of the critical parts is to brainstorm as many possible outcomes for each issue as possible. There's a tendency toward binary thinking, which is I'm going to win this one or I'm going to lose this one. And we don't want it to be all or nothing. We want to think about what are lots of different things that could happen in the middle, because that allows us to figure out where can we trade things off. So if there's an issue that's worth a lot to us, there might be 2 or 3 other issues that all together could be just as valuable. And if we can figure out where those trades are, then as opposed to thinking about, do we win this, do we lose this, we can think about, well, maybe job function flexibility over here is worth a certain amount in the hourly wage over here. And we can shift the discussion instead of who wins to what's more important to you. And that's where we start to unlock the real opportunities. That, of course, also requires more openness and more listening. So instead of just reacting to proposals purely from a defensive stance, we need people to pause, to properly assess what's being put on the table, and to consider whether there might be opportunities within a proposal that aren't immediately obvious. And a scorecard can help with this because it externalizes the thought process as opposed to keeping it sort of within our own head where it's more instinctive and more identity driven. And then in terms of planning around the other side, I think we want to think about things like who on our team has actual relationships with folks from the union. Can we gather information? Can we get a finger on the pulse of what's worrying them? What are they talking about? What are they thinking about? Because I know there's a stereotype, it's all about the wage rate. And I think that's a shortcut that both sides tend to use. But if we can get better understanding of really where those conversations are happening and what people want to achieve on the union side, then we can think about, well, how does that overlap with our issues? How do we convey the overlap to them? How do we start crafting both an opening, the way that we're going to use our language? We might have some early meetings in a low threat environment. We might talk to people on the work site, but all of that is around establishing a common frame when we do walk in.
Yeah. And all really important work to do as part of your pre-bargaining planning, but also work that takes time.
Yes.
So essential that we, as employers, allow sufficient time ahead of commencement to do that work. Back to the economics, if we can, Jen. Do you think it would be helpful if employers were more open, more transparent about the challenges facing their businesses as part of the bargaining process? And if so, how might that be done? Because that's often approached with a degree of skepticism from the employee and union side.
Yeah, I absolutely think transparency is one of the most powerful things that employers can do to make a more effective opening. And for some reason in business, we all share this idea that everything has to be very secret. And of course, some things do, but at the same time, it's hard for people to trust when they don't have the ability to sort of vet and understand where your assertions and your numbers and your estimates are coming from. We also always tend to believe, just as human beings, as human psychology, that other people already know the things that are in our heads already. So we simultaneously feel we have to keep things secret and think other people already know everything. And both of those lead to, I think, inadequate sharing. I always come back to the story of one of our alumni from the Advanced Management Program at MBS. She created and led a New Zealand government agency that was in charge of resolving issues around the Pike River mining disaster, where 37 men didn't come home one day due to a methane explosion, and their bodies couldn't be recovered. And there was a great deal of hostility between the families of those miners and the New Zealand government. And this woman's agency was in charge of resolving this. So one of the first things she did, she recognized she needed to start building trust with the families. And she took every report, every file, every bit of data and analysis that they had collected about the accident, and she put it all on an open website. And she didn't ask for permission. And in fact, many people questioned whether this was an okay thing to do. But in the end, the New Zealand government adopted as law the idea that the default would be open sharing of information. And her action made a huge difference. So obviously it took time and it took additional effort, but the transparency allowed the families to become convinced that they knew what the decision space was. Nobody was holding things out on them. Nobody was lying to manipulate them into a different decision. And so together, they were able to make decisions about whether to go back in and try to recover their bodies of the men who had died. And the families themselves decided that should not happen because they didn't believe that any more lives should be put at stake, even though they had argued for years that recovery should be attempted. And everything was because they had access to all the information that pointed to the severity of that risk. It is obviously a very tough sell for employers to convince union members that there is genuine economic trouble. There's a whole history of assertions being made that profitability or even survival of the firm depends on concessions from the union, and then later on it turns out that wasn't true. So I think it would be a huge step forward if instead of just saying we're having trouble, you need to accept cuts, employers would open the books and share that problem solving with employees, challenge the employees to find solutions. The sticky bit, of course, is that some of the suggestions and some good solutions might go in a way that distributes the pain in a different way than the employers had contemplated. But if we're all trying to do what's best for the company and ensure that it not only survives but also thrives, then not foreclosing before we get started is a really smart thing.
Yeah, which is perhaps a different approach for some organisations, and
I'm sure.
doubt there might be some limitations or controls required as to what's shared. But I think also important in my experience that though that disclosure, that transparency doesn't just start at the commencement of the bargaining process. Yeah. Because it's relatively common for workforces to hear about economic headwinds at roughly about the time that bargaining starts. But much better, of course, if that level of transparency is the default and is the norm, I guess, outside of the bargaining environment to create that trust. And as we said at the start of this episode, it is possibly the most difficult negotiating environment for enterprise bargaining that we've seen in some time. And given the industrial relations reforms from 2022, 2023, rolling out the same approaches that employers have in the past simply aren't going to be effective. The change in negotiating leverage, negotiating power has been quite significant. And that calls for different approaches, more robust preparation, probably more time and resources dedicated to that preparation, better understanding of these new rules and what they permit and prohibit and where the opportunities might lie to regain some of that leverage, but also a new mindset to the actual negotiation itself and perhaps investment in those negotiating skills that you've been talking about, Jen. It's certainly more important than ever, and it's those skills that are going to help try and shift that negotiation into that more productive space, focusing on those longer term interests and less so about those shorter term interests and try and grow the pie rather than just argue about the size of the slice, which I think brings us to an important announcement. Jen, I've been admiring the work that you and the team at Melbourne Business School have been doing with experienced commercial negotiators as part of your advanced negotiating course. And I've often thought it would be super helpful if you had a course that was perhaps a bit more geared to the industrial relations lens.
Absolutely. And we have designed a 3-day program that features your own expertise, Rohan, going through the new legislation and changed environment for industrial relations bargaining. The program is designed to be highly practical and relevant to what organizations are dealing with today around IR bargaining, integrating the newest developments in the regulatory space with proven negotiation frameworks, covering areas like enterprise bargaining, negotiation planning, multi-party dynamics, stakeholder alignment, strategy, and complex environments. So this gives us the foundation to do large multi-party negotiations in the program with a 2-level structure that parallels IR negotiation. So you have constituents who aren't at the table but can determine whether a deal actually goes through, very high fidelity. We talk about systems thinking in these negotiations. How do you manage the process? How do you manage the parties? How do you manage the issues? We incorporate some game theory, talk about defining what value are you actually negotiating for? So really getting concrete about that. And then how do you signal intentions and how do you read the intentions of the other side? It's an intensive program that will really boost skills, boost confidence, and boost mastery of the IR space. And it's aimed at both practitioners and leaders where IR negotiation is a material part of their activities, as well as those who might be adjacent to those negotiators, such as business leaders who make decisions about bargaining or strategy. And across the program, participants will also hear from experienced negotiators through an expert panel, and they have the opportunity to learn and connect with others in the program who are navigating similar challenges. So the key outcome is that participants leave better prepared for today's IR landscape and more confident heading into upcoming negotiations. And I'm really excited to be working with you on it.
Likewise, Jen. Very much looking forward to delivering the Melbourne Business School Advanced Enterprise Bargaining Negotiations course with you later this year. And a big thank you from us for joining us on the podcast today. It's been really interesting discussion and some quite helpful insights for employers across the country to think about. If you are a HR or IR practitioner with responsibility for enterprise bargaining, or perhaps a lawyer or business leader with oversight about the process, involvement in decision making, do keep an eye out for the course. You can get further details from the Melbourne Business School website very shortly, or contact one of your friendly Herbert Smith Freehills Kramer team members and we'll point you in the right direction. As always, we'd love to hear feedback on Inside IR, so feel free to comment, direct message, or send an email to insideir@hsfkramer.com. Otherwise, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Inside IR.